Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth, Courtney, president of LPB. Well, our moderator for this evening's important conversation is Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid. You worked hard for that. I'm going to give it to you. A higher education expert. She previously worked in Governor Kathleen Blanco's office during both Hurricanes Katrina and Rita.
And it's great to be here with you, Beth. You know, it's been 10 years since these storms rolled through South Louisiana, and our state has seen many changes. We have 2 new agencies charged with ensuring our protection and improving emergency preparedness. Our statewide economy is stronger, educators are taking new approaches to teach students, and healthcare delivery continues to evolve across the state.
Well, how much of this change was a direct effect of the hurricanes, and how much would have happened anyway? Tonight's discussion is only a portion of our broad reporting on the hurricanes and recovery. Tomorrow evening, PBS stations across the nation will air our documentary, Katrina 10 Years After, A Second Life, A Second Chance. And Friday, a special edition of Louisiana, the state we're in, will feature the man who restored order to the city, General Russell Honore. But this evening is a conversation with citizens. As we reflect on the aftermath of the storms, we'll ask, how do we build on the last 10 years and continue to improve? And are we safer than we were 10 years ago? We explore these issues and more on Louisiana Post-Katrina, A Decade of Difference.
There's not really an easy way of, a simple layout of steps that they give you. You sort of just make it up as you go and hope your zoning's right.
Heather Lane moved to New Orleans 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina made landfall. After a series of odd jobs, she opened a cafe and gallery in the St. Roch neighborhood. That was 5 years ago.
Chris runs the coffee shop. Yes. I run the pottery studio, more or less. I have help and teachers.
Compared to other large southern cities, New Orleans has a high number of individuals opening up businesses, about a third more than the average.
It's a great atmosphere in terms of the people. Everybody's really supportive. The minute you say you have this idea, this little seed, something you want to open, something you want to do, all your neighbors are there.
But are individuals starting businesses to make up for so many business closures after the storm? Allison Plyer is the executive director of the Data Center. The organization studies economic indicators in New Orleans and southeast Louisiana. She says yes, there were spikes after the storm, but New Orleans has continued to exceed regional and national averages.
When you have a recession, that folks start up businesses because they can't find jobs. And you saw an uptick in the nation during, from 2008 to about 2012. And then you see sort of a downtick. And so here we're seeing a downtick as well, and still we're 64% above the national average.
Immediately after the storm, there was a rebuilding boom. 10 years later, there's a new focus on bringing jobs to the state. Regional economic development chambers have become more organized, but that needed improving before the storm.
If you think back to 2005, that we were coming up on 25 years of consistent net out migrations.
Jason L. Koubi is executive director of OneAcadiana, the Lafayette Chamber. He has filled economic development roles in the capital region and statewide.
So even before Hurricane Katrina, the people in Louisiana were getting sick and tired of telling their sons and daughters and their friends goodbye as they searched for economic opportunity elsewhere.
$100 billion worth of economic development projects have been announced, many in the Lake Charles area. Southwest Louisiana has faced twice the challenge in rebuilding, weathering Hurricane Rita in September of 2005 and Hurricane Ike 3 years later. Cameron Parish was especially hard hit. That is not to say storm recovery caused the economic expansion, El Koubi says.
Making economic development a top priority resurfaced as we thought about the strategy for rebuilding and the strategy for recovering from these disaster events.
Policymakers from across divisions of state government say problems needed to be addressed before the storms. Recovery provided an opportunity to implement changes, like replacing Charity Hospital with neighborhood clinics. Department of Health and Hospitals Secretary Kathy Kliebert.
We were already trying to design things differently prior to that, so it was truly an opportunity to take all the lessons that we've learned, the research that tells you we want preventative care, we want local clinics, we want people to be able to go to get the right care at the right time.
State Superintendent John White says education outcomes have improved in New Orleans. That's due in part to charter schools, he says, which give teachers and principals greater autonomy than traditional schools. Communities across the state are seeing an increased number of charter schools.
That's not because the State Department of Education or the State Board of Education has some plan for that. It's because folks in urban communities in particular are saying, look, for years, especially low-income kids in my community are not seeing upward results. Well, we've got to do something different.
Before the storms, the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, or GOHSEP, didn't even exist. Now it acts as a one-stop shop for local governments when a disaster hits their area.
When they feel that it's time, or it's going to be time soon, that the state maybe starts sending some help, we are their first call, and we are their only call.
Deputy Director Chris Guilbeaux says GOHSEP has changed the way the state deals with catastrophes on down to small emergencies.
That event brought us together, and we were able to get over those hurdles of individual parishes and individual cities and really come to understand that it's a one-all fight. Before Katrina, if a parish evacuated, it was on that parish to figure out where they were going to bring their people.
Though the past 10 years have brought significant changes, policymakers need to continue to strive to improve Louisiana, Koubi says.
As we reflect on the last 10 years, we need to dig deep, and we need to find the fire to maintain an urgency around the hard choices, the focused investments that we know are going to take our state to an even greater level, that are going to connect us in greater ways, and that are going to leverage the full potential of our great state and the many great communities that make it up.
Joining us to explore a decade of difference is our studio audience. With us tonight, we have mental health experts, citizens, coastal advocates, and educators. We appreciate everyone for being with us. You know, LPB asked viewers and social media followers to participate in an online survey on tonight's topic. With over 100 responses, here's a look at some of the findings. We asked some of the same questions about Louisiana's economic outlook that were asked 8 years ago by Louisiana Speaks. Louisiana Speaks was a statewide survey and planning guide commissioned by the Louisiana Recovery Authority. When we asked individuals to pick their top 3 priorities for economic development, they gave nearly the same answers. In the original survey, 59% of respondents said the state should focus on attracting and retaining companies. 55% said it should expand job skills and vocational training, while 49% leaned toward strengthening colleges and universities. This year, an even number of respondents held strengthening colleges and universities and expanding job skills and vocational training in equal regard at 65%. 52% chose attracting and retaining companies. As far as the policy changes adopted by the state since the storm, respondents were pessimistic. 40% held a negative outlook on what these changes have done to K-12. 30% think it's changed for the better or somewhat for the better. Now, in the area of health care, 61% feel that health care delivery and access has changed for the worse or very much for the worse across the state, and only 19% feel that it has changed somewhat for the better. In terms of preparedness, 67% of respondents think the state is somewhat prepared to handle the next hurricane. 13% feel the state is very prepared. 11% think the state is not prepared at all. So let's start there. How has Louisiana recovered in the past 10 years? Do you think the state has changed its policies for the better? And how prepared is Louisiana for the next storm? These are the conversations we'll be having right now with our audience. And Boo, I'd like to turn to you because we talked obviously about the Louisiana Speaks comparison. Tell me, where are we now?
Well, one of the phrases that we used all the time after the storms was that Louisiana needs to be safer, stronger, and smarter. And so I would I think there are a few illustrations that say that we are. I'm not going to talk about healthcare or education or the economy, but I'm going to talk about some of the policies that were put in place. Let's just talk about the International Building Code. When Gustav and Ike hit, there were houses that had implemented the building code and did withstand that storm surge. Yes. So that was a good thing. The other thing that we've seen is that in parishes across our state, pre-Katrina and Rita, we only had at most 14 parishes that had any sort of plan in place that looked at economic development, land use, transportation, infrastructure, green space, all of those things together.
Right.
Today, over half of the 64 parishes have those, and something like 30 to 35 communities have plans in place that address all those. So that's a sea change. Planning strategies were not respected in this state, and now they are.
And that's a great thing.
That's a huge difference, and you can see the differences in our communities, that we're embracing what made Louisiana special, what made our culture special. Scott is from Sunset, and that's one of those jewels, like Lafayette, like Abbeville. So we're going back to that.
I appreciate that. Now, when you talked about that, you said, I won't talk about education, but I would like to talk about education. Judy, I know that your school, St. Thomas More, took in a lot of students. Tell me about that experience.
When the storm hit, I guess our faculty and the day after, the faculty, the staff, the office just came to school to check on it. And as we were there, we realized that families were coming to the school. And their first priority were the well-being and the education of their children.
Right.
And once the children were cared for, then they could go on and plan their future. So what we did was house 436 children.
Wow.
Sister Michaeline was the superintendent of the diocese at that time, and really reached out to all the schools to say, do what you can do. And so our pastor at that time was Father Mike Maroney. We walked around the campus, we walked around the church, we walked around the youth house to see where we could have classrooms and what teachers we needed to hire. And so it was a wonderful experience in knowing that you were able to help and your entire community came together to support the families.
Thank you so much, Judy. And I know, Mark, in terms of evacuations, obviously we had a tremendous responsibility to get people out of harm's way and the real challenge of a huge mega storm. Where are we now with evacuations and the ability to protect Louisiana citizens?
I think a good example was Hurricane Gustav. In Hurricane Gustav, because of the nature of the storm, we essentially evacuated all of southern Louisiana. 2 million people evacuated. It's the largest evacuation in U.S. history. And it was a very successful, almost seamless evacuation. We had not only the routes to go, but we had places for people to go. We had agreements with 8 other states across the nation to house people that had to evacuate. And not only did we evacuate effectively, when the storm was over, we brought people back in a systematic manner to get back into their homes and see what they had to do to recover.
And Carl, in terms of law enforcement, lessons learned, obviously communication was critical and so many other things. How far have we come and what have been the lessons learned?
We've come a tremendous way. One thing that Katrina did, it tested the system. It was so massive, it put so much strain on every resource we had in Louisiana that it showed us where the gaps were. And probably the greatest thing that's emerged out of this is the police, the sheriffs, the state police, GOHSEP is all working together. I can't really say that before that time, to the extent that they're working together now, so that now we have, and I think state police has custody of them, the ability to augment communications. One of the big problems in Katrina is radio towers blow over.
Right.
When we had no communication, officers were taking off into a city with no power. They couldn't see where they were going half the time because there's, and out of communication with any kind of command and control. We now have command and control centers. We have a marvelous facility set up at state police, and GOHSEP is part of that. We also have the forward command posts with steady information feeds, things that did not exist then.
Right.
So I think Louisiana is far better, more able to cope with this kind of disaster. And one last thing, our self-contained emergency response units, which are now all over the state.
Good.
So that if say a, God forbid, Katrina type storm were to strike Abbeville, it wouldn't matter if we lost the units in Abbeville. We can pull them from Monroe.
Good.
We can pull them from all over, and they're self-contained.
You know, one other thing that was obviously difficult was the human toll, obviously. And Jan, I'd like to hear from you in Capital Area about the mental health issues that people have dealt with. And I guess for some, 10 years has really seemed like not that very long in terms of being able to recover and cope.
Well, I just want to kind of do a shout out to everybody that has spoken before, because I think one of the things that we got out of Katrina, the silver lining, was that we all learned about how each other works, and that I feel like if we were tested again, that we would have close connections to law enforcement and education and city planners and the government. We had wonderful people coming from all over the country, really all over the world, who came and were deployed, and it was the beginning of us using mobile teams to go out to corners, the LSU campus, large areas with hotels, apartment houses, and people went out as a mobile team, and we hadn't really experienced much of that, but psychiatrists, social workers, nurses, and medical doctors, so it was the first time we actually used integrated teams to make sure people were taken care of. But I have to say that it's been a very difficult time, and 10 years doesn't really even feel that long, especially with people who struggle with mental illness, that there are not a whole lot of options. Right after the disaster, we did receive a lot of federal dollars, and we were able to very quickly respond. People got help. We worked very closely with law enforcement and the emergency departments, but the federal money isn't here anymore. And I think everybody could speak to the budgets and how the budgets have continuously diminished. And it's been a very hard time to deliver not only the amount of services, but the type of decentralized services that a lot of people need. The loss of low-income housing in New Orleans has had a big impact on all of the other cities, and I would say particularly Baton Rouge, because people with disabilities don't have a whole lot of money. Their rent has to be small. When you don't have places like that, you end up in places that none of us would really choose to live or wouldn't want our citizens to live in. And so low-income housing has a huge impact on people who have disabilities and don't have the funds to live in safer neighborhoods or stable home situations, or to have the support that many of us really would like to deliver and know that they need.
Thank you so much. And I want to talk also about the school system, the evolution of the school system. We saw the survey. Some people think that K-12 has not been helped through the policy changes. Others think it has. Obviously, it's been a big conversation. Scott, love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I think the jury's still out, and the data needs to be scoured more carefully. In national politics, we hear lots of talk about the New Orleans miracle, and I would venture to say that before we characterize what has happened in New Orleans as a miracle, we should take a look at how the Vatican determines a miracle. They get all the facts and look through the data and make sure that the data speaks for itself and that there's no question about exactly what's going on. There's still a huge amount of inequity as far as housing and the creation of schools and rebuilding schools in the most at-risk areas in the lower 9th Ward, the 7th Ward. And at the end of the day, it's not in any attempt to discredit any of the hard work of the many, many charter schools that have popped up, but in regards to the success or lack thereof of the Recovery School District, which was a direct result of Hurricane Katrina, which opened the door for many, many schools to be taken over and recreated. That needs to be carefully studied, and there's a whole other story that's not being highlighted in the media, which is the impact on our most at-risk students in the New Orleans area and the disenfranchisement of the citizens to be able to have a school board to address very personal and serious issues that need to be addressed.
Hold it right there, because I want to make sure we get Eric in as well on that issue of the charters. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess I would take a different perspective on that. And so looking pre-Katrina, where our schools were in New Orleans and actually statewide, and the standards that we set for our students, the standards that we set for our schools. And so if you look today in New Orleans, there's a 63% proficiency rate of students in schools in New Orleans on state standardized testing, where we had some schools where it may have been 13%. We had kids who were graduating as valedictorians of high schools in the state who couldn't pass, who couldn't enter into college, and they were valedictorians of high schools in the state. And so I think some of the things that have been put in place, so the legislation for the Recovery School District was passed before Hurricane Katrina hit. There were schools in New Orleans, schools in Baton Rouge, schools in Shreveport that were eligible to be taken over by the Recovery School District before the storm hit. And so I do agree with the fact that because of the parameters that were put, that came out of the storm, that effort was expedited. But I think we have a number of schools and a number of families that are in situations that are far better off than they were prior to the storm. And so if you look at the data and the growth that we're seeing in schools in New Orleans compared to the growth in schools across the state, the trajectory has been phenomenal because of a lot of the policies that have been put in place.
Can I just ask one quick question of everyone in the room? Raise your hand if you think that Louisiana is better off than we were 10 years ago in terms of recovery overall. So that's unanimous. Unanimous that you all think that. Great. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the conversation. That's all the time we have for this portion of the show, but we will return when we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further explore Louisiana post-Katrina, a decade of difference. Stay with us. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're discussing Louisiana post-Katrina. Joining us now is a panel of experts. Andy Kopplin is currently Chief Administrative Officer to New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu and served as Chief of Staff for both Governors Kathleen Blanco and Mike Foster and staffed the Louisiana Recovery Authority. Thanks for being with us, Andy. Thank you. Stephanie Riegel is editor of the Greater Baton Rouge Business Report. A New Orleans native with a bachelor's degree from LSU and a master's from Tulane, she moved to the capital city after Hurricane Katrina and has reported extensively on the economic changes in the region. Glad to have you. Thank you. Nihal Shrinath is a data manager and research associate at the Data Center. And the Data Center collects data on disaster recovery, regional economic analysis, and racial disparity indicators. And we're happy to have you with us. And of course, also Paul Rainwater, who leads Rainwater Consulting, a lobbying firm. Now, at the time of the storms, he served as Chief Administrative Officer to Lake Charles Mayor Randy Roach. I'm partial to that city. He also served the Louisiana Recovery Authority and worked as Chief of Staff and Commissioner of Administration for Governor Bobby Jindal. So thanks to all of you for being with us. This is a very important conversation, and wow, 10 years. Just doesn't feel like it in some ways, and in some ways it does. So before we go to this wonderful group of audience members who have lots of questions, I'd like to start by engaging you. As you look back 10 years since the storm, what major policy change do you think has been most affected since Hurricane Katrina and Rita? Paul, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I mean, the reality of it is, if you look at when Andy was Chief of Staff and became the Director of the Louisiana Recovery Authority, and I worked on the staff, we talked about, what do we do from here? And the reality of it is we were kind of given a clean slate in the fact that, New Orleans had been devastated, parts of South Louisiana had been, rocked fairly hard by Hurricane Rita. So we made our decision, as Andy said, let's dream big. Right. And the reality of it is, if you looked at healthcare, you looked at education, you looked at transportation, you looked at the way we do our cities, the way we plan our cities, we involved the entire southern part of the state in a planning effort to make things better in Louisiana. And I think there's not one policy that's not been affected by those storms going forward, whether it was law enforcement or the way we respond. Every aspect of life and policy, I think, has been affected by those two storms.
Because they were just massive.
They were massive.
Absolutely. Nihal?
Yeah, so I'll speak to one specific policy change that has been, enormous after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and that's our policy regarding environmental resilience. So post-Katrina, in the special session, the legislature passed, essentially created this implementation authority for all activities that have to do with coastal restoration and protection, the CPRA. And then coupled with that, from 2007 to 2009, consecutive state surpluses were dedicated to coastal restoration and protection. There's a bipartisan kind of groundswell of support for restoring our coast, and restoring not just our levees and our last lines of defense, but also our first, second, third, so on lines of defense. That's continued until the 2012 Coastal Master Plan. We have a $50 billion 50-year plan to restore our coast, and we have the mechanisms in place. In a lot of ways, the Louisiana voters voted to dedicate oil spill or oil rig funding or oil rig revenues to coastal restoration and protection in 2006. We've seen on a state, parish, and federal level dedication to restoring our coast, and that's really the biggest change in trajectory going forward.
Thank you so much for that. And Stephanie?
I would have to agree with that, but so as to not be redundant, I think one of the most significant things that we have seen emerged, and it's not a policy per se, but it's a new way of doing business in Louisiana, and some of y'all alluded to that earlier. The creation of the super region mindset, where you really have seen the Baton Rouge and New Orleans business communities coming together in a way that was unthinkable a decade ago. There really is a literal super region committee comprised of Baton Rouge area chamber members and Greater New Orleans Inc. members, and you see them collaborating on infrastructure and transportation projects, efforts to try to create an intercity rail between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, for instance. They take recruiting trips together. They go overseas and try to market the region as a super region. They work together collaboratively on coastal restoration issues, on highway issues, on airport issues. And I don't know if that's the single most important policy change that has come out of Katrina and Rita, but is certainly one of the most significant results.
Andy, you were on the front line of so much of this. What are your thoughts looking back?
Well, as you asked the question, I remember, and you probably do as well, Kim, because you served as Governor Blanco's policy director at the time of the storm. The governor said to all of us the day after the storm, our jobs have changed forever. They will never be the same.
That's right.
And I think a lot of folks in Louisiana took the opportunity to reflect. And as Mayor Landrieu, my current boss, often says, it's time to do things the way we shouldn't recreate what we had. We should build the city back the way she always should have been built had we done it right the first time. And I think when Paul talked about the list of reforms, Nihal about the CPRA, I think people have taken to heart this question of, okay, it is our moment now. How are we going to make sure that we honor the sacrifices of all those folks who were lost in the storm, the property damage and all that, by rebuilding in a smarter and a better way. And so those policy changes that I think were most significant, the one I'm going to highlight is the school changes in New Orleans that Governor Blanco led. New Orleans is poised to be the first urban school district in America without a single failing school, and that is a radically different transformation of educational opportunity for kids that's going to make all the difference in the city going forward.
Thank you so much. And I know that as we talked about that, Andy, there was a conversation about, and Judy's here, and was talking about all the students who came in. And so people were looking for normalcy, and school represented that. But I know that for so many parents, the governor said, parents will know what to ask for. They will have gone to other cities and seen a better school, and so they will come back with higher expectations. And so I think we all have expectations that we continue to elevate our state and build it back better. So there are lots of issues, but John, I want you to ask your question.
All right, thank you, Kim. I'm John Lopez with Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation. As a coastal scientist, kind of look at the hard numbers all the time in terms of wetland loss, sea level rise, subsidence, and also recognizing that recovery isn't the same thing as sustainability. Recovery maybe gives you the opportunity to be sustainable. So my question is considering those things that are happening, can New Orleans survive in the next 100 years? And what do we do to make sure that it will survive?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on that if I can.
Yes. Sure.
I think it can and it will, but it's not going to happen by accident. We're going to have to take deliberate action. So this week, as we commemorate the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, the city of New Orleans is launching its resilience plan. And basically it's a plan about how we can sustain the city of New Orleans for the next 100 years. Our 300th anniversary is in 2018. And the questions we need to ask were actually asked in a video that is a little cartoon video about a young man in New Orleans named Marcel, who's growing up over the next 50 years. And the question that we're asking ourselves in New Orleans is, what decisions are we going to make today? And how can we make those decisions to make sure that Marcel has a great New Orleans to live in and work in and grow in 50 years? And I think if we ask the right questions, we look head on the challenges of climate change and subsidence and coastal loss, and take deliberate action to address those, New Orleans can thrive in its fourth century. But it's not going to be by accident. We're going to have to make tough, difficult choices and be true to them.
Good. Gina, you have a question?
I did have a question. During the storm, I was a social worker. I am a social worker. And after the storm and during the storm, I worked with people who were having emotional problems. My background is psychiatric social worker. And my question for you was, do you think that we are better prepared or worse prepared for dealing with people who have psychiatric problems? And I wanted to know what your thoughts are. I was thinking about Marcel, and I hope Marcel does not have a mental illness, and I hope he comes from a family that has good resources. But if he doesn't, do you think that we are prepared to help Marcel in those kind of circumstances?
I'd like to, I was a responder in New Orleans right after Katrina and Rita, and Ike and Gustav. I finished, 2 tours, and one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq. And coming back, and what you recognize in not just responders, but citizens, nurses, doctors, anybody that was, in Katrina, basically the post-traumatic syndrome that occurred afterwards. And I had a number of friends that were firefighters who had to retire for different reasons because of the things they saw. Obviously, working with Andy at the Louisiana Recovery Authority, then running the Road Home program, people that were having difficulty dealing with those issues. I think that we as a community and as a state recognize now that the trauma that occurs from people who survived through horrific storms, whether it was Katrina, Rita, and the other things that have happened in this state just recently with other storms that have occurred. I think we recognize that even more, and there's a good, strong conversation, I think a healthy conversation about mental health and the effects that occur after such traumatic events like Katrina and Rita. So I think we are, and I think we're willing to at least have that. We started having that conversation after the storms, and I think when you look at what's happened with the nonprofits and foundations that have been built up in New Orleans and Lake Charles and other parts around the state, I think we're ready to to tackle that issue should there be another event.
I'd like to add to that. I work with people every day. I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and I counsel people who have the same challenges as a peer. And I want to say, no, we're not. Matter of fact, it's gotten worse. And it's been 10 years, and I know we're talking about policy and data, and those are great things. But what the bottom line is about people. And there's still a lot of people who lost a lot of stuff, not just their lives, but their livelihood. They got discombobulated, and they're still in a state of trauma. And trauma is real. And I know we've done a lot of stuff, to deal with that, but we haven't done enough. The dollars have left. I was with a nonprofit at the time when Katrina hit, and money flowed in, but now, a lot of budget cuts have happened, and so people are still suffering. And just today, I met with a lady who is still, having challenges being treated because of the things that happened to her, during Katrina. So we still have a lot to do in that area.
No doubt. There's much to be done. What about the data? What does it tell us about these issues of poverty when it comes to recovery?
Sure, absolutely. I think one thing that's really important is we have all these plans. We have a plan to restore our coast. We have a resilience plan in the city of New Orleans, but do we have the political will to fund it? As you see in New Orleans, we've seen tremendous economic growth. We've seen 5% growth in jobs within the metro region as opposed to 1% within the United States since 2008, since the Great Recession. However, at the exact same time, we've seen poverty levels rise to the point at which they were pre-Katrina. So within the city of New Orleans, we see 27% of folks living in poverty, 39% of children living in poverty. And those are two truths that can coexist. You can have economic growth, but you can also have growing inequality. Right. And you see that across the nation as well. really, we talk about the different types of programs that we can, use to address it, but we really need to have programs that are tied to that data and tied to those metrics. On the state level, when we're talking about economic development, can we tie them to high-wage jobs? Can we tie our subsidies? Can we tie the money that we're spending on economic development to local jobs, well-paying jobs, and jobs that can address this growing poverty rate, at least within the New Orleans region.
And I do think that's an important challenge that we do need to address because, we've had the joyful opportunity to go down to New Orleans, and it seems that on one hand, there is prosperity that's returning to the city, and yet I guess my concern is that for those who were the most vulnerable and perhaps the most impacted 10 years ago, is that sort of prosperity, that rising tide, is it, we talk about a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, and I guess I'd like to hear from the New Orleans folks about policies maybe that are, whether they're federal, state, or local, that are really trying to address, sort of raising that tide for, for everyone in for everyone in New Orleans.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the challenge of our time. Right. I don't think there's any doubt that folks know that we had a lot of problems in New Orleans before the storm, and they were exposed to the world in the days after the storm, the poverty, the inequality, the lack of opportunity. And Mayor Landrieu's commitment to the people in New Orleans is we're not leaving anybody behind. So as we're thrilled by 9,100 new jobs created, and the fastest growing population, we've been recognized by the census 4 or 5 years in a row as one of the fastest growing cities in the country. So all that kind of energy is very positive, but if it doesn't reach all New Orleanians, we're not done with our work, and the recovery is not complete unless everybody is able to engage in that. So job training programs are critical. We talked about the school reforms, but the mayor's introduced an economic opportunity strategy, which is really designed to take the 52% of African American young men who are out of work and connect them to job training in a specific job, building our new airport, rebuilding the sewer and water system of the city. And we're trying to be very intentional about it for just the reasons that you described, because we're not going to be complete as a city unless everybody shares in that rising tide.
And I think that's terrific to hear, because my wife and I, we have a 21-year-old who's just a recent college graduate living uptown in New Orleans, and to tie some of the policies that, Andy, you're talking about, and to connect that to the enthusiasm, the real sort of grassroots enthusiasm that so many young people have who are flocking to New Orleans and sort of supplementing the sort of that rich talent that is kind of homegrown. We've lived in Louisiana for 25 years, didn't grow up or born or raised here, but we've had the good fortune to be able to travel a little bit, and when they say there's no place like home, there really isn't, and Louisiana really needs to be protected because it's special. It really is unique, and unique places are few and far between.
And that diversity is such a strength for New Orleans, and it's going to be what guides us going forward. We're going to be much better because of it, and we've got to embrace all the opportunity for young people across the city.
It's so true, and so many people have come and volunteered and been a part of it, and it's been wonderful. And Stephanie, I know you moved from New Orleans to Baton Rouge and have written about that, and tell us a little bit about what you have seen in your experience moving here.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I came here really with fresh eyes, and I was burned out on New Orleans, as I wrote recently in a column. I mean, I had been a TV reporter there. I had just seen the worst of what the city had, especially in those years before the storm, and I was one of the ones who gave up on New Orleans. I mean, I thought it was done, and I had little kids, and so I wanted to bring them here where I felt like they would be safer. And it was a wonderful place, and just seeing the growth in Baton Rouge over the past 10 years has been phenomenal. The downtown development, the new people that came to New Orleans with Katrina and really brought this city up. A lot of the growth would have happened anyway economically. We were on a trajectory to grow, and Baton Rouge did, though. But I was wrong about New Orleans, and it's been wonderful to see how that city has rebuilt, and all of the infusion of new blood and new ideas that have come with the young people and the entrepreneurs that wanted to rebuild it. It's been interesting now that I've gotten to know Baton Rouge a little bit. I've come to see some of the problems here too, and the thing that I always come back to is that this is all South Louisiana. I mean, we're all in the same boat here, and to really distinguish between the two cities to me is foolhardy in a way, because when you look at us compared to an Atlanta or a Houston or North Carolina, where we just lost Albemarle to today, the headquarters, and you see that we really have to think of ourselves as one region,
Right.
rather than as two separate cities competing over crumbs. And that's really what I have taken away, after 10 years of being here. I love both cities, but it's like pizza and ice cream, or they're just very different, but they're
Red
both
beans and rice.
They're both. I don't know if I use that metaphor, but they're both great places. They really are.
Yeah, and the data center, we've done some analysis of really these connections. These connections are not just conceptual. In 2010, 68,000 people commuted between the Baton Rouge Metro, the New Orleans Metro, and the Houma-Thibodeau Metro. And that was an 11% increase from 2004. So not only are we are very connected, we're more connected, and it's likely that the numbers more recently are going to bear that out. And what's more important is that we have ties in terms of freight flows. Baton Rouge and New Orleans have more common freight flows than Baton Rouge and any other place combined. We have very similar industry specializations, maritime shipping, oil and gas, water management increasingly. And we also have really a shared workforce. And so going forward, Baton Rouge and New Orleans are not going to benefit by competing. When you go outside of Baton Rouge and New Orleans, when you go outside Louisiana, folks don't think of them as competing regions. And when you're talking about bringing companies or bringing jobs or even just bringing people to this region, you're talking about bringing people to Southeast Louisiana, not one or the other.
I got a comment.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
We talk a lot about the cultural aspects of the cities that we're in South Louisiana, and we talk a lot about it. But Paul and I have been up to D.C. several times talking to Congress, and a lot of the questions we get, like from the senator from Wyoming, why is it important that the federal government invest all of the money that they've invested in the recovery of Louisiana, which is literally $100 billion across the spectrum? And the answer is, to that, it came in to my acknowledgement during Gustav when the governor got a phone call from the governor of Vermont and says after Gustav, are my gas prices going to change again? Right. 40% of the fertilizer that goes to the Midwest to grow corn comes through the port of New Orleans.
Right.
All of what we do down here is economically important to the entire country, not just to us.
Exactly right.
And so our recovery, our resilience, our ability to do this again is very important to the entire country. And I think that's a message that we need to make sure that the country knows. They're not so much interested about our culture. They like to come down to New Orleans and play a little bit and eat food, but that's it. Then they go back home. They have to understand why the money that they're investing here is important to them.
Mark, that's an excellent point. One of my former bosses in one of my jobs, former Senator Mary Landrieu, when she was fighting for recovery dollars, would stand on the Senate floor with a map of the pipelines that run from Port Fourchon and Cameron and go up and out. Mm-hmm. And the reality of it is, it was an interesting question about whether or not New Orleans would survive. It's not whether or not it will, it has to.
Right.
And the reason it has to is because of all the jobs that are centered around the energy that the rest of the country uses. And so it's an excellent point. I think the congressional delegation has done a pretty good job for the size of a state like this to sell the fact that Louisiana is important to rebuild. And you look at the amount of federal money that we received, whether it was rebuilding levees in New Orleans or Terrebonne or Lafourche or rebuilding Calcasieu Parish in Cameron, and then you look at the economic growth, even with oil prices down, you still look at the amount of infrastructure that's being built around energy around the southern part of the state. It's phenomenal. So it's an excellent point, Mark.
Yes, Boo.
I wanted to just address, let's just say we have 40,000 new jobs coming along the Mississippi corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans,
yes,
which is a great economic indicator, wonderful boon. And maybe it's not that many or maybe it's more. Mm-hmm. But we are in a transportation crisis right now, because if we can't get the people in New Orleans who need those jobs to these companies along the river, what good have we done? And they are jobs that could be had by the underemployed in the New Orleans area and could help with the whole poverty issue. But that's why, the rail is so important, public transportation, transit, different modes of doing this. And so that is an issue that was present pre-Katrina and Rita. It's even more exacerbated today, and those are the issues that we've got to face as a state and as a country.
Stephanie, I want you to talk about that. I know there were some transportation conversations that you were a part of and reporting about.
Well, and one of the biggest
ones, as Boo mentioned, has been the efforts to get the intracity rail between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. But more recently, too, I think there have been a lot of efforts to address the transportation and infrastructure needs, certainly in the Baton Rouge area. DOTD is starting to pay serious attention to it. They're starting to do a feasibility study about addressing some issues along I-10. There's even talk of moving towards a second Mississippi River Bridge across Baton Rouge, and that's such a tremendous issue because this is the only spot in the whole state where I-10 narrows to one lane as it crosses the river. So that's something that we really, really need to look at. You started to see the gubernatorial candidates in this election and also the business communities in Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and the super region really talking about addressing some of the changes, some of the transportation changes that are needed, about possibly raising the gasoline tax to facilitate some of the construction. It's the first time that people, I think, it's too early to say that we're going from the talking stage to the action stage, but we're going from maybe the talking stage to the really serious talking stage, which is a positive development. And that's again where you see the cooperation between the two cities very badly needed and much more effective too.
Good. I want to get to Joseph Booth, who was with state police at the time, but has recently done a couple of reports released on Katrina. Can you speak a little bit about the reports and your question?
Sure. Two reports, as you indicated, both on behalf of LSU. I led research teams in these research projects. The first one, the sponsor was Walmart, and they were interested in how has New Orleans improved their resiliency, and how has the private sector influenced, and how can the private sector influence resiliency and overall preparedness and the sustainability of a community. And we looked at things like the evolution of technology and disaster management, and the value of preparedness, and the value of working with the private sector and stimulating a stronger partnership to expedite recovery. And we found, of course, as you would expect, a strong correlation there, but we also found that New Orleans had done a very exceptional job in developing the private and public partnership as a way of stimulating recovery. The second study, which we released just a couple hours ago, by the way, it's on the LSU website, measuringrecovery.lsu.edu. And the Office of Community Development in the City of New Orleans asked us to take a look at how did Louisiana spend the billions of dollars, almost $14 billion we looked at, in recovery funding post-Katrina, post-Rita. And there's a strong correlation between the investments by Louisiana and stimulating the very interest that they were designed to recover, for instance, housing. Strong correlation between the investment and the recovery of housing in most areas, not every area, but the same thing with public infrastructure, and it actually lent to the fiscal health of the local government.
So as a result of that, Joey, tell me what would you ask now that you have done that work? What would you ask of the panel?
You know, what I would ask the panel is that how do we take the lessons that we learned from like from this study? And you know, in a lot of areas, in Paul and Annie, you guys, y'all were there, and we were breaking new ground because no one had ever responded to an incident like a Katrina.
Right.
The laws were not designed for a Katrina-size magnitude event, and so we had to really kind of make it up as we went. And so we did a lot of things good, but we want everybody to learn from the mistakes and from the things that we did well. How can we export that learning to the other jurisdictions? Because frankly, like I tell you, since Katrina, I'm looking at some of the other responses, and you know, if you erase the name of the storm and change the date, it could be Katrina all over again. Now, how do we export that to save people from going through what we did and benefiting from the good things that we did and implemented?
I think we've done some of that. I mean, Andy and I have served on a number of panels, in different parts of the country. I'm doing some storm work, actually recovery work up in New York. Have a consulting firm that's doing some work there around Hurricane Sandy. But I will tell you, it's by example, really. And I have to use Hurricane Ike as a perfect example of kind of the lessons you learn and the lessons you can transport to other parts of the state. And the reality was, in Cameron Parish, there was a 12-bed hospital. And there was a question about whether or not to rebuild that hospital or not. And the federal government said you probably shouldn't, because if another storm, it's going to get flooded and destroyed. And we got together as a Recovery Authority staff and made the decision it needed to be rebuilt because, in Cameron, if you didn't have a hospital, because it's so far down south, you wouldn't be able to recover economically. And we look at all the growth that's occurring to Cameron now. It was a really good decision. But after Hurricane Ike came through, we built this hospital 12 feet based on the new floodplain management standards. We'd hardened it. The whole facility was hardened. Ike comes through. The water comes through. Wildlife and Fisheries goes up to the building to make sure there are no survivors. It's after the storm. The water's right at the base of the facility. And so there's a great, concern about, whether or not the facility was damaged or not. They opened the door and there was an alligator that had hidden inside the hospital itself. So we said, that's a great example of resiliency and the kinds of things we want to show the rest of the country, that whether it's New Orleans or Terrebonne or Lafourche or St. Mary Parish or Vermilion or Cameron, this is a safe place to invest because we know how we've learned the lessons of Katrina and Rita, Ike and Gustav now. We understand how to respond. We understand how to build higher and safer, as Boo said. Those are real lessons that I think we can transport and you can see it at Tulane, at LSU, and others that have academic programs now around recovery and disaster recovery, disaster response. I mean, that's how you do it.
Joey, a tell of how we do this. Kiplinger's newsletters designated Louisiana as the most disaster-prone state in the Union for the last 2 years in a row. But every disaster that happens, our office, GOHSEP, gets a phone call from that state. Can you send people up here to help us understand what we need to do? And we do that. So we export our experiences almost every day.
And we're creating some jobs. I mean, Paul just described a couple that he may have created, but a lot of Louisiana businesses are not just subcontractors, but prime contractors in New York. I wanted to thank Joey for the study that LSU's done and highlight another point in addition. Bad things are going to happen. That's what a resiliency plan is all about. We're going to have hurricanes. They might be worse. We don't know what kind of shocks are going to hit us. The question is, how quickly will we get back up?
Right.
One of the things that the private sector does really well is logistics. And one of the pieces of the study was complementing the state's small business grant and loan programs. And, they weren't trying to create IT firms. They were trying to get restaurants and gas stations and shops and fishermen back up. And it was those loans and grants that helped provide the services that made it possible for folks to come home. And it was a really interesting point about you got to have the house. You also have to have the small business where you can get groceries. And those are the kinds of ways that if we plan those things intentionally, so we're ready to get up quicker than anybody else, South Louisiana is going to be able to survive well into the next century and prosper.
One of the things that we understood through the experience of Gustav was that at a governmental level we were siloed and that we weren't including the business community. So we stood up what we call the Business Emergency Operations Center, which is actually housed at LSU, and it's a place where business representatives from all the industrial sections come and they locate like we would in the Emergency Operations Center at the state level. Right. And so when we need data from the businesses, how are the gas stations affected, that we can get that data? Or when we need support from those same, like the Restaurant Association, can you provide hot meals to citizens of South Louisiana? We've got it. We're on tap with them now, and we get that feedback from them at the same time that it's a whole community process. And so we're much more effective at how we get back into the recovery phase than we were at the time of Katrina.
And let's not forget, I'm sorry, the faith-based community. Come on now, guys. We didn't have the red tape that you guys had to go through, and we made it happen real quick. We did.
Right. You did.
So, I mean, you're right, business, private sector, but also the faith-based community as well.
No doubt. No, absolutely, no doubt about that. One thing I want to make sure we talk about is sort of the faces of Katrina, right? So we had an opportunity to try to help ourselves and help others, but it took the entire nation to help our citizens. And as Andy mentioned, this face of poverty. This was the first time I think that America really got to see the collision of disaster and poverty. And so Rick was there on the front line as a photographer, and I asked him to earlier to talk about two things: his photo that represented Katrina and his photo that represented recovery. And so can you just sort of share your reflection?
Well, the photo that I remember most from Katrina, I was there at the Hyatt, at the Superdome, at the Convention Center. My rental truck was up 3 floors and it was flooded down below, so I was stuck right there, which was good because I was able to walk all around that, and it was probably the best place to be as a photographer. There was a woman that I photographed who's dying right in front of my eyes, in front of the lens, and there's nothing I could do about it because she's on the outside of the glass, and we're on this side, and just watched her die and be carted off to the side. So I never got to find out who she was, never knew anything about her, what her story was. So even 10 years later, it still really bothers me that I have no idea who she is. To go about photos of recovery, I'm going to be diplomatic and say that I'm just impressed with still all the photographers that think it's worthy of still being down in New Orleans to cover it. A lot of people have forgotten about Katrina and moved on, but there's a select group of photographers that are still going down there day in, day out, people that live there mostly, and then people that are still coming in, and the newspapers and magazines that think it's worthy to invest in sending people down there still. It's becoming fewer and far between, so it's impressive that they're doing that.
Thank you so much. And we've run out of time for question and answer segment, but we certainly thank our panel for being with us. Andy and Stephanie and Nihal and Paul, thank you so very much for the conversation, for your insights on this important topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments. Stay with us.
Well, certainly we could have this conversation go along for an awful long time, and a lot of topics we just briefly touched on, but I'm sure there will be many more conversations in the days to come.
Absolutely. It has been a decade of difference, whether it's education, economic development, coastal restoration, so many issues with a mega storm, 2 big storms. So there's a lot of big conversation to be had, and certainly we touched the beginning of a big conversation that needs to continue.
And we always want to say Katrina and Rita, and for those of us in Baton Rouge, Gustav, certainly as we remember all of those things. So all the storms we had touched on tonight, but that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. While you're there, take this month's survey, view additional sound bites, and comment on tonight's show. We would love to hear from you.
Next month, we remember Rita with a special edition of Louisiana, the state we're in. It's Friday, September 18th at 7 p.m. We'll dedicate the entire show to see the recovery efforts that are unfolding there 10 years after Rita. And then next month's Louisiana Public Square will delve into the state's fall elections. What issues will candidates face, and where do they stand? Are there issues that should be on their radar but are not? And how do campaign promises become viable solutions for our state? Tune in Wednesday, September 23rd. Thanks again for watching, and good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.